The war in Iran has the potential to completely cripple Russia. There are several aspects of the conflict that directly threaten Russia's place on the world stage, economically, geopolitically, militarily, and even demographically. In addition, the increased US involvement, President Donald Trump has all but declared war on Iran, means that Russia is now in a more precarious position than ever before. Let's go through a few of the most critical aspects the Russian war machine stands to lose from the continuing bombings of Iran. In the first place, no real surprise, is the fact that Iran has been a steady supplier of drones to Russia. You see, as soon as Ukraine managed to repel the initial invasion within the first few weeks following the assault on Kyiv, the war devolved into one of attrition. Russia was more than willing to throw men and its old equipment into the fire and hope for the best. But another weapon proved to be far more effective at the job: drones. And Russia's drone capabilities ended up pathetically inadequate compared to Ukraine's rapidly expanding fleet. Moscow was bleeding conventional missiles and precision-guided munitions at an unsustainable rate. This led to drones becoming one of Iran's greatest exports. Let's delve into some numbers. Between September 2022 and September 2024, Russia launched over 8,000 Iranian-made Shahid drones at Ukrainian targets. These flying mopeds, as Ukrainians call them, became the backbone of Russia's terror campaign against Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. Iran initially supplied Russia with up to 3,000 drones, primarily the Shahid 136 model, which cost around $20,000 to $50,000 each, a bargain compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars required for each interceptor missile Ukraine used to shoot them down. The Shahid 136 is a masterpiece of cost-effective single-use long-range ordnance. Composed mostly of foam, paper and plywood, each drone is about 11 feet long, with an 8-foot wingspan and carries a 110-pound warhead at its nose. The drone's brain consists of a sensor the size of a cough drop that measures every movement, while a credit card-sized GPS unit listens for microwave signals from navigation satellites. Its 50-horsepower motor generates the distinctive sound that earned these weapons their flying moped or flying lawnmower nickname. But the real genius lies in their operational concept. These aren't precision weapons, but economic warfare tools designed to overwhelm expensive defense systems with cheap and expendable attacks. Each Shahid attack forces Ukraine to expend NATO-donated interceptor missiles worth 10 to 20 times the cost of the incoming drone, creating an unsustainable cost exchange ratio that slowly bleeds Ukrainian air defenses dry. Russia quickly recognized the strategic value of the drones and limits to which Iran can build them, moving to domesticate the technology. As early as June 2023, Moscow established a drone manufacturing facility in Yelabuga in Tatarstan. The Russians rebranded the Shahid 136 as the Garan 2 and began mass production with Iranian technical assistance. With the staggering amount of money that Russia can inject into its industries, considering nearly 40% of its government spending goes into the military-industrial complex, some sources suggest that the country had domestically produced over 10,000 drones by the end of 2024, over 3 times what Iran has likely sold throughout the war. But Russia's domestic production faces critical bottlenecks that the Iran war can only make worse. The production still depends on Iranian engineers and technicians who provide crucial expertise in navigation systems, warhead assembly, and quality control. Russian attempts to fully reverse engineer the technology have struggled with sourcing electronic components, particularly GPS systems and flight control software that require constant updates and refinement. As a result, Russia's Garan variants suffer from high failure rates, even more so than Iranian-produced originals. In some of the recent large-scale attacks, Russia is losing roughly 82% of its drones and missiles, likely partially due to inferior components that allow Ukrainian countermeasures to divert them into barren fields. The Yelabuga facility has also faced chronic labor shortages, forcing Moscow to recruit students and foreign workers to maintain production quotas. These workers lack the specialized knowledge that Iranian technicians brought to the production process. Additionally, Ukraine's long-range drones are now more capable than ever. In June alone, Ukraine has pulled off the Operation Spiderweb, smuggling drones some 2,200 miles into Russia to damage or destroy vital strategic bombers. It stands to reason that the same effort could be replicated for any given production facility, meaning that Russia's drone manufacturing is in constant threat from attack. On the other hand, Ukraine can't conduct precision strikes on Iran. There are many reasons for that, but all boil down to the fact that Iran's production and exporting were one of the few secure ways Russia could get effective drones into its forces, and Iran can no longer afford to export Shahid drones to Russia. With Israeli F-35s and US stealth bombers targeting Iranian drone production facilities, Tehran desperately needs every drone it can produce for its own defense or saber-rattling retaliation. Of course, Iran being unable to export more drones to Russia is a double-edged sword. When domestically produced, the Shahid drone is estimated to cost between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on the exact model. But export prices to Russia were reportedly far higher, up to $104 million for batches of drones and associated systems, representing a massive markup over production costs. The difference allowed Iran to fund its weapons research and production. Effectively, by being able to supply Russia with weapons, Iran supported its own defenses and made Russia one of its biggest investors. Considering that the war in Ukraine has grown to a scale where Iran's export capacities can't keep up, and with the war with Israel diverting resources to domestic equipment, both countries have something to lose. Russia will need to stick with the rebranded Geran drones, which may or may not be capable of dealing with Ukraine's defenses, while Iran won't have the funding lifeline from Russia. But funding is far from the only thing that Russia is providing to Iran. Russian President Vladimir Putin has used the Middle East as a geopolitical chess move designed to distract Western attention and resources from Ukraine. Moscow's presence in Syria, its partnerships with Iran, and its mercenary operations in Libya were all calculated moves to force Europe and the US to distribute their attention and resources across multiple theaters. This strategy worked only up to a point. The Iran-Israel war doesn't create the distraction Putin hoped for. Instead, it strengthens Western resolve in ways that directly threaten Russian interests. When Iran responded to Israel's attacks with hundreds of drones and missiles, Europe didn't see another Middle Eastern conflict requiring careful diplomatic balance. It saw the same showcase of authoritarianism that Ukraine has been fighting against for the past 3 years. And European leaders might no longer be interested in appeasement. Already the likes of the UK and France, two countries with nuclear deterrence strategies and weapons on their own, have pushed forward with ideas of direct displays of force through military deployment, something that directly contrasted the 3 years of back-and-forth discussions of what amounts of donations is just enough for Ukraine to defend itself but prevent Russian escalation. Those sentiments are more likely to resonate further in the European communities as another war starts raging on their doorsteps, threatening to create more waves of immigrants on the border. Additionally, Europe is in a favorable spot economically. In late May, the EU adopted the 17th package of economic sanctions against Russia, one which puts yet another stranglehold on the latter's ability to access vital resources, technology, and equipment to fuel its war machine. The longer the war goes on and the more Europe believes it has the upper hand, the more it can tighten that noose around Russia's economy. Russia has also maintained the strategy of using Middle Eastern chaos to overwhelm European humanitarian and economic programs, forcing the EU to develop extensive programs to aid ever-increasing numbers of immigrants and refugees. But the recent political turnabout in some of the largest economies adopting more right-wing ideologies and parties could spell an end to the tactic. Europe could start swaying more towards supporting aggressive military intervention to end conflicts quickly rather than managing prolonged refugee crises. Take Syria, for example. When Assad's regime finally collapsed, it wasn't European refugee policy that brought it down, but decisive military action backed by internal rebellion groups and overwhelming economic pressure. After the fall, Russia similarly backed out of the country with little fanfare, showcasing that its hold on power lasts as long as it lacks sufficient pressure. And Russia's role as the supporter and strategic guide may be waning in more than just the Middle East. Putin might lose his position as the ideological leader of BRICS, the economic bloc that was supposed to challenge Western dominance and restore Russia's status as a contender for a global superpower. BRICS, a 10-member international organization consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, was fundamentally a Russian creation, spearheaded by Russia's former foreign minister to try and curtail the influence that the US could exert across the world, particularly in the former Soviet countries and the currently developing ones. For Putin, BRICS is more than economic cooperation. It allows Russia to organize the non-Western world around Russian and Chinese interests. The Iran crisis shatters that illusion completely. China's response to the Middle East conflict exposes the new reality, one that positions Beijing, not Moscow, as the nation that ultimately sets BRICS policy. China pursues a carefully calculated strategy of neutrality, designed to position itself as the indispensable mediator between all parties. On the other hand, Russia's aggression in Ukraine and an inability to create the terms of an effective ceasefire imposed by the US has made Putin lose credibility as a thought leader and peace negotiator. This isn't by accident, but the result of China's systematic economic colonization of Russia over the past 3 years. China has become Russia's economic lifeline in ways that fundamentally compromise Moscow's sovereignty. In 2024, China purchased $82 billion worth of Russian fossil fuels, significantly more than India's $50 billion, and representing roughly a third of Russia's total energy export revenue. But this dependence comes with devastating strings attached. Chinese companies can now control critical supply chains that Russia needs to sustain both its economy and its war effort. When Moscow needs semiconductors, rare earth elements, or industrial machinery to maintain weapons production, it must turn to Chinese suppliers, who demand increasingly favorable terms. Beijing has leveraged this dependency to secure massive discounts on Russian energy, often 30 to 40% below market rates, while positioning itself as Russia's only reliable technology supplier. This power imbalance becomes crystal clear in energy negotiations. Despite Putin's repeated promises that Russia and China are close to signing gas contracts for the proposed Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, Beijing continues to stall negotiations. China has demanded that it pay domestic rates for the export, which is 4 times lower than what it's currently paying for existing structures. Chinese negotiators know that Russia has no alternatives, so they can afford to wait until Russia can drop its counter-demand to follow suit. China's passive approach to the Iran-Israel conflict is a signal to Moscow on exactly how it expects Russia to behave, avoiding confrontation with the West, focusing on economic rather than military solutions, and deferring to Chinese leadership on major international issues. For a regime that's built its legitimacy on projecting military strength and challenging Western power, this is basically humiliation. The Iran war accelerates how quickly Russia can fall from grace and into China's clutches. As Russia's Middle Eastern partnerships collapse and its European energy customers disappear permanently, Moscow becomes even more dependent on Chinese markets and goodwill, which links it even further to its external policies. Putin faces an impossible choice: continue supporting Iran and risk Chinese displeasure, or abandon his Middle Eastern ally and accept junior partner status with China. Either way, Russia's days as presenting itself to be the direct ideological opponent of NATO, and more particularly Europe, are numbered. But the reason China is particularly invested in maintaining good relations with the Middle East is that the region has something that China needs: oil and gas. This is where Russia is actually a solid competitor with something to gain, but not enough to matter in the long run. Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz makes it uniquely positioned to affect global trade and influence geopolitics disproportionate to its actual size and military power projection. In 2024, oil flow through the strait averaged 20 million barrels per day, equivalent to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. At first glance, any disruption to this vital waterway should benefit Russia as an oil exporter. If Iran attempts to block or significantly disrupt traffic through this crucial waterway, oil prices could skyrocket above $100 per barrel, potentially reaching the record highs of close to $150 seen in 2008. Higher oil prices would theoretically mean more revenue for Moscow's war chest, but the reality is far more complex. While Russia can export oil, China is the one that maintains trade between the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz, alongside other BRICS members like India. Additionally, South Korea and Japan, 2 historical US allies with defense agreements, also rely on shipments from the Arabian Peninsula. Around 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade also transited the Strait of Hormuz in 2024, primarily from Qatar. When Europe turned off the tap from Russian gas pipelines, it started using Qatar as one of its major suppliers. And there lies Putin's nightmare scenario. With both Russia and the Middle East severed from legitimate global oil and gas trade, major economies will look for other sources. Countries like Canada, Brazil, and Norway are all major oil exporters that aren't involved in international wars or geopolitical controversies. They can position themselves as much more attractive alternatives to Russian oil in the global market. While Russia deals with an increasingly complex web of sanctions, shadow fleets, and international isolation, these countries can offer stable, sanction-free energy supplies to nervous global markets. The Russian Finance Ministry has already lowered its 2025 oil and gas revenues forecast to 8.32 trillion rubles, equivalent to $101.47 billion, or 3.7% of GDP, from 10.94 trillion rubles, $139 billion, or 5.1% of GDP, due to falling oil prices and reduced demand. The Iran crisis threatens to accelerate this trend. If global buyers seek stable alternatives to both Iranian and Russian oil, Russia ends up in the worst possible position. It has higher production costs due to sanctions and international isolation, combined with steadily declining market access as buyers prefer more reliable suppliers. Even China, Russia's largest energy customer, already uses that leverage to demand significant price discounts from Moscow. Russia's ability to maintain oil revenues despite sanctions depends almost entirely on what's known as the shadow fleet. It's a massive armada of aging, often unseaworthy tankers that transport Russian crude while flying under foreign flags to evade detection. The scale of this operation is staggering. Some estimates suggest that there are between 350 and 600 Russian shadow vessels used to transport crude oil, making up nearly 1/5 of the global maritime crude oil trade fleet. Even worse, the shadow fleet is targeting even the EU itself, as some countries are actually paying more for Russian oil on the side than they are allocating for Ukrainian donations. This isn't just sanctions evasion, it's the backbone of Russia's war economy. Without the Shadow Fleet, Moscow would lose more than 75% of its maritime oil export capability, which directly feeds into its capacity to fund the war effort. The Iran-Israel conflict turns this asset into a catastrophic liability. As tensions escalate in the Middle East, US and European naval forces can dramatically increase surveillance and interdiction operations throughout the region. The same waters that the Shadow Fleet uses to transport Russian oil to Asian markets can become hunting grounds for Western navies looking to prevent Iranian retaliation against shipping. The EU's sanction packages are increasingly banning suspected Shadow Fleet vessels from entering EU ports, while Denmark, Sweden, Poland, Finland, Estonia, and the UK inspect insurance certificates of oil tankers along routes used by the Shadow Fleet. The Iran crisis provides the perfect justification to expand these operations dramatically. Shadow Fleet vessels depend on avoiding scrutiny, operating in international waters with minimal oversight, and maintaining plausible deniability about their cargo origins. But war in the Persian Gulf, one of the spots for maritime oil trade, means ships will become even more of a commodity, being under satellite surveillance and aggressive interdiction protocols designed to prevent Iranian military supplies from going in or out, or terrorist attacks. This means that the pressure on Russia's aging vessels just gets bigger with every attack from Israel and Iran. And many of these vessels are already operating at the margins of seaworthiness. They're aging tankers with questionable maintenance and minimal safety equipment, and crews willing to work illegally for cash payments. Under wartime conditions, with Western navies actively hunting for potential threats, these ships become sitting ducks. Their illegal status means they can't request naval protection, can't seek assistance in international waters, and can't dock at most regional ports for fuel or repairs. Considering that we are already seeing a decline in Russia's oil trade, this could be the final nail in the coffin. Russia has already hiked state spending on national defense to around 6.3% of GDP, the highest level since the Cold War. This war economy is siphoning funds from pretty much every other industry to fuel the military-industrial complex. However, it also depends on two critical assumptions that the Iran conflict shatters completely. The first is that Europe will remain dependent on Russian energy exports. The second is that Russia can continue to leverage nuclear threats and energy blackmail to control European responses to the Ukraine war. Both assumptions are now demonstrably false. European gas imports from Russia dropped from 40% in 2021 to just 11% in 2024, and the EU is committed to ending all Russian gas imports by 2027. More importantly, Europe has successfully navigated multiple energy crises and proven it can function without Russian energy when necessary. As Middle Eastern energy supplies can now become unreliable, European countries are doubling down on renewable energy investments and diversified supply chains that exclude both Russian and Iranian sources. For example, Germany is considering reopening its nuclear power reactors, despite shutting them down in 2023 as an indirect consequence of the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. But by far the most devastating consequence of the Iran war for Russia isn't economic or military, it's psychological. European countries are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the possibility of achieving peace through economic and military support alone. Ukraine's defense has proven that NATO donations can prevent Russian victories, but they haven't forced a Russian defeat yet. But in the opening hours of the Iran-Israel war, it's the US that has surprisingly made the first calculated move to annihilate suspected nuclear enrichment facilities, which suggests that Europe might follow suit in its decisiveness. It might not do so with direct military action, but the past several months were spent with major European economies reviewing and increasing military spending budgets, as well as positioning themselves to work separately from the US in terms of global geopolitics. This represents Putin's worst nightmare, a Europe that has overcome its energy dependence on Russia, proven its ability to weather economic storms, and developed the political will to use aggressive measures to force Russia's hand in Ukraine. The war in Iran won't just cripple Russia's war machine, it will end Putin's ability to sustain the conflict in Ukraine altogether. And when that happens, the Russian leader who once commanded one of the world's largest energy empires will find himself presiding over an isolated, economically devastated state that can no longer project power beyond its own borders. If you like this video, consider watching our predictions on how the Israel-Iran war could turn out. And for more analyses on how global conflicts are reshaping the global balance of power,